My boyfriend left me after getting me pregnant at 16. Years later, he is devastated to hear what happened to his son. When I was 16, I thought Derek was everything. Star quarterback, college-bound, the kind of guy who made other girls jealous. We'd been together 8 months when I missed my period. I'll never forget telling him. We sat in his car after school, rain drumming on the roof. The parking lot was empty except for a few teachers' cars. I'd been carrying the secret for 3 days. 3 positive pregnancy tests hidden in my backpack like contraband. When I whispered the words, his face went white. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the rain. 3 tests, sure. He stared through the windshield for what felt like hours, watching water cascade down the glass. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. Then he turned to me with cold eyes I'd never seen before. "I can't do this. I have scholarships, college, my whole future ahead of me. Coach is already talking to scouts from Division I schools. What about my future?" I whispered, touching my still flat stomach. "That's not my problem anymore." The words hit me like a slap. This was the boy who'd told me he loved me just last week, who'd talked about going to prom together, about visiting each other at college, who'd held my hand and promised we'd figure everything out together no matter what life threw at us. He dropped me off at home without another word. The next day at school, he pretended I didn't exist. When I tried approaching him between classes, his friends would form a wall. Brett Morrison actually laughed when I begged him to tell Derek I needed to talk. "She's just trying to trap you, man," I heard him say. "Everyone knows girls like her get pregnant on purpose." The humiliation was unbearable. Girls who used to be my friends suddenly had no time for me. Teachers looked at me with disappointment, like I'd confirmed their worst expectations. I started eating lunch in empty classrooms to avoid the whispers and stares. Within 2 weeks, the rumors had spread through our small-town high school like wildfire. That I was desperate, that I'd lied about being on birth control, that I was trying to ruin Derek's future out of jealousy. Nobody seemed to remember that he'd been just as eager as I was in the back of his pickup truck that night after homecoming. My best friend Rachel stopped sitting with me at lunch. When I asked her why, she shrugged and said her mom didn't think it was appropriate for her to associate with girls who made such poor choices. Lisa Chen, who'd been my lab partner since freshman year, requested a transfer to another table. Even my younger cousins stopped acknowledging me in the hallways. The isolation was crushing. I'd gone from being part of the popular crowd, dating the quarterback, invited to every party, recognized and respected, to being a cautionary tale parents used to scare their daughters straight. My parents found out when Mrs. Henderson from the pharmacy called my mother. Apparently, buying pregnancy tests in a town of 3,000 people wasn't as private as I'd hoped. Dad was waiting for me when I got home from school. His face was stone cold, disappointment radiating from every line. He was still wearing his work clothes, button-down shirt and slacks from his job at the bank where he'd built a reputation as an upstanding member of the community. "Is it true?" he asked. I nodded, unable to speak. "You've disgraced this family," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "Everything we've worked for, everything we've built in this community, and you throw it away for some boy who won't even look at you now." Mom stood behind him, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't say a word, just watched as he threw my suitcase on the porch. I could see the shame in her eyes, the way she couldn't even look at me directly. I thought about the ladies' auxiliary meetings she attended, the church committees she served on, the bridge club that met at our house every Tuesday. How would she explain her daughter's disgrace to women who measured their worth by their children's achievements? "Don't come back until you fix this mess," he said, slamming the door. I stood there in the rain, 17 years old and completely alone, watching the only home I'd ever known disappear behind a closed door. The porch light went off, leaving me in darkness. I moved in with my Aunt Rochelle across town. She was my mom's younger sister, the family black sheep who'd gotten pregnant at 15 and never married the father. Her apartment was tiny, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people. But she cleared out her spare room, moving boxes of old books and photo albums to make space for a bed. She hung up cheerful yellow curtains and put fresh sheets on the twin bed she'd bought at a garage sale. "Yellow's good for boys or girls," she said, rubbing my barely there bump with gentle hands. Nobody else in my family would speak to me. My cousins, my grandparents, even my younger brother, they all acted like I'd died, like acknowledging my existence would somehow contaminate them with my shame. Uncle Ted, who used to sneak me extra dessert at family dinners, looked right through me at the grocery store. My grandmother, who'd taught me to knit and always sent birthday cards with $20 bills, returned my letters unopened. The silence was deafening. 16 years of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and Sunday dinners, erased because of one mistake. One moment of teenage passion that had seemed so right at the time. I got a job bagging groceries at Peterson's Market on the edge of town. The manager, Mrs. Petrosky, was a grandmother herself who'd raised 4 kids as a single mother after her husband died in Vietnam. She let me work flexible hours around my doctor appointments and didn't ask questions when I had to sit down between customers. The work was exhausting, standing for 8 hours, lifting heavy bags, dealing with customers who recognized me and whispered behind my back. My feet swelled until I could barely fit into my work shoes. My back ached constantly, but I needed every dollar for the baby. Diapers, formula, clothes, medical bills. It all added up to more money than I'd ever imagined. I made lists and calculated costs obsessively. A pack of newborn diapers cost $8 and lasted maybe 3 days. Formula was $30 a can and wouldn't last a week. The crib I wanted cost $200, which represented 40 hours of work after taxes. Meanwhile, I watched through social media as Derek lived his best life. Posted photos from senior parties I wasn't invited to anymore. Celebrated getting his full ride to State University. Full tuition, room and board, even a meal plan. Everything I dreamed about when we made plans to go to college together. He took another girl to prom, Madison Thorne, whose dad owned the biggest car dealership in 3 counties. She wore a dress that cost more than I made in 3 months, and they looked perfect together in all the photos. Her smile was radiant, his arm protective around her waist. They were crowned prom king and queen, standing on stage while everyone cheered. I deleted all my social media accounts after seeing their prom pictures. His arm around her waist, that same smile he used to give me, the same look in his eyes that had once made me feel like the most important person in the world. The comments were full of perfect couple and so happy for you both and what a beautiful future they'll have together. Nobody mentioned the girl he'd abandoned, the baby he'd walked away from. For 9 months, I prepared to be a single mother. I read every parenting book the library had, some of them multiple times. What to expect when you're expecting became my Bible. I memorized charts about fetal development, learned about contractions and breathing techniques, studied photos of newborns so I'd know what to expect. I took childbirth classes at the community center where I was the only one without a partner. The instructor, a cheerful woman named Brenda who delivered 6 kids of her own, tried to pair me with other students for exercises. But watching couples practice breathing techniques together only emphasized how alone I was. The other mothers would glance at me with pity while their husbands rubbed their backs and talked about nursery colors and college funds. They'd discuss baby names during breaks, debating whether Michael or Matthew sounded more professional, whether Emma or Emily was too popular. I'd sit quietly, knowing I'd already chosen Oliver, a name that meant peace. I painted the tiny nursery myself, soft green walls with white clouds that took me 3 weekends to get right. I watched YouTube tutorials to learn the technique, practiced on cardboard until I could make clouds that looked real instead of like cotton balls glued to construction paper. Aunt Rochelle helped me assemble the crib I'd bought secondhand from a garage sale. The previous owner had included the original manual, and we spent an entire Saturday afternoon deciphering diagrams and sorting tiny screws. When we finally finished, she stood back and smiled. "He's going to love it," she said confidently. "How do you know it's a he?" I asked. She shrugged. "Just a feeling. Women in our family have always been good at predicting these things." Everything was ready by my 8th month. Diapers stacked in neat rows according to size. Newborn, size 1, size 2. I'd bought them gradually, 1 pack each paycheck, storing them like treasures. Bottles sterilized and waiting in the kitchen cabinet. A hospital bag packed with the few baby outfits I could afford, all from the clearance rack at Walmart, but washed in gentle detergent and folded with care. I'd practiced the route to the hospital so many times I could drive it in my sleep. 13 minutes during regular traffic, 8 minutes in the middle of the night. I knew which entrance led to the maternity ward, where to park, which elevator to take. The nursery became my sanctuary. I'd sit in the rocking chair Aunt Rochelle had bought at a thrift store, solid wood that just needed new cushions, and talk to my belly. I'd tell the baby about my day, about the books I was reading, about how much I already loved him. Because somehow I knew it was a him. Call it mother's intuition. I talked to him about everything. The job at the grocery store where Mrs. Patterson always asked about my health and Mr. Williams slipped me extra hours when he could. The library where I spent my breaks reading pregnancy books and planning our future. The doctor appointments where I heard his heartbeat and saw his profile on ultrasound screens. I talked to him about his father too. How smart Derek was. How good at football. How charming when he wanted to be. I practiced what I'd tell him when he was older. That daddy had been young and scared. That it didn't mean he didn't love him. That sometimes people make mistakes they can't take back. I promised him things would be different for us. That I'd never abandon him the way I'd been abandoned. That we'd figure out this life together, one day at a time. As my due date approached, I prepared for labor with the dedication of an athlete training for the Olympics. I did prenatal yoga videos in the living room, practiced breathing exercises, timed practice contractions. I wanted to be ready for anything. Then labor started at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. I woke up to cramping that felt different from the Braxton Hicks contractions I'd been having for weeks. These were deeper, more insistent, wrapping around my entire torso like someone was squeezing me with giant hands. Aunt Rochelle timed them while I paced around her tiny living room, breathing through each wave of pain like they'd taught us in class. She made chamomile tea and toast, even though I couldn't keep anything down. She packed last-minute items, phone charger, lip balm, the stuffed elephant I'd bought for the baby. By noon, we were at the hospital. The maternity ward was cheerful, pastel colors and inspirational quotes about motherhood on the walls. But the optimism felt forced when you were 17 and alone, shuffling down hallways in a hospital gown while other families celebrated new arrivals. The labor was long, 43 hours of pain that started manageable and built to something I couldn't have imagined. The contractions came in waves, starting as dull aches and crescendoing to agony that made me understand why women screamed during childbirth in movies. Aunt Rochelle held my hand through every contraction, wiped my face with cool cloths, fed me ice chips when my mouth felt like sandpaper. She never left my side. Even when the nurses offered to bring her a more comfortable chair or suggested she go home to rest. I kept asking for drugs, but the baby was in distress. His heart rate kept dropping during contraction, the monitor beeping warnings that made nurses rush in to adjust my position. They couldn't give me anything that might affect him, so I endured it all. Every crushing contraction, every moment when I thought I might die from the pain. Dr. I. Martinez, who'd been my obstetrician throughout the pregnancy, stayed with me through shifts that should have ended hours earlier. She was a small woman with kind eyes who spoke to me like I was a grown-up instead of a scared teenager. "You're doing great," she'd say during the worst moments. "Your baby is lucky to have such a strong mama." The baby was breech. They discovered this 18 hours in when they finally did an ultrasound to check his position. His feet were coming first instead of his head, which made everything more complicated, more dangerous. Then the cord got wrapped around his neck. The monitors started beeping frantically. Nurses rushed in from everywhere, their calm professionalism replaced by urgent efficiency. Someone was shouting medical terms I didn't understand. variable decelerations, cord prolapse, emergency cesarean. Dr. Martinez, who'd been calm and reassuring throughout my pregnancy, suddenly looked terrified. She ordered me moved to an operating room, barking instructions to nurses who scrambled to prepare equipment. They tried everything first. Vacuum extraction that left marks on my baby's perfect head. Forceps that looked medieval and terrifying. Emergency procedures that required consent forms I signed through tears, not understanding what they meant but trusting that these people would save my child. I remember screaming for them to save him, begging God to let him live, promising I'd be the best mother in the world if he just took his first breath. I'd give up everything, my education, my future, my own life, if my baby could just be okay. The pain was secondary to my terror. Every beeping monitor, every urgent whisper between medical staff, every grimace on Dr. Martinez's face told me something was wrong, very wrong, but he never breathed. The room went silent except for the sound of machines and my own sobbing. They worked on him for 27 minutes. I watched the clock, counting every second. CPR on a tiny chest that looked too fragile for such aggressive intervention. Medications injected into vessels too small to see. Procedures that looked violent on someone so perfect and small. When they finally stopped, Dr. Martinez's face was grim. She looked at me with eyes full of professional compassion and personal grief. I could see that this wasn't just another case to her. She was genuinely devastated. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "We did everything we could. Sometimes these things just happen, and there's nothing anyone could have done differently." My world shattered into pieces I didn't know could be reassembled. They cleaned him up and placed him in my arms anyway. He was perfect. 6 pounds, 2 ounces of absolute perfection. 10 tiny fingers with the smallest fingernails I'd ever seen. 10 tiny toes that should have been kicking. Derek's straight nose. My stubborn chin. Dark hair that stuck up in impossible directions. He just wasn't breathing. I named him Oliver James. Oliver because it meant peace. James after my grandfather who died when I was 12. The only family member who'd never judged anyone for their mistakes. I held him for 3 hours, talked to him, sang lullabies I'd practiced during pregnancy, told him all the things I'd planned to say when he was awake and listening. I told him about the nursery waiting at home, about the books I wanted to read to him, about all the places we would have gone together. Aunt Rochelle sat beside us, crying quiet tears and taking the only photos I'd ever have of my son. She used an old camera with actual film, knowing these pictures were too precious for a phone that might break or get lost. Finally, a gentle nurse named Beverly came to take him away. She'd worked in the maternity ward for 30 years and had the kind of calm presence that made terrible moments bearable. She wrapped him in a soft blue blanket and promised me I could see him again whenever I wanted, that he'd be taken care of with dignity and respect. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and arrangements no mother should have to make. Choosing a casket small enough for a newborn, selecting a burial plot in a section of the cemetery I'd never noticed before, where all the tiny headstones stood in neat rows like baby teeth. The funeral director, Mr. Carlson, was kind but practical. He'd handled many infant deaths and knew how to guide grieving families through impossible decisions. He showed me catalogs of tiny caskets, helped me choose flowers, arranged for a simple service. The funeral was small, just me, Aunt Rochelle, and Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church. I'd never been particularly religious, but Aunt Rochelle thought Oliver deserved a proper service. She paid for everything. The casket, the burial, the small reception afterward at her apartment where we sat in silence and tried to understand how someone so wanted could be gone so quickly. I bought a tiny white casket with money I'd saved for his college fund. $847 that was supposed to be the start of his future. The gravestone was simple. Oliver James, followed by the same date twice. Born and died, March 15th. Beloved son. I didn't tell my parents. They'd made it clear I was no longer their daughter, so Oliver wasn't their grandson. They'd forfeited the right to know about him when they threw me out. I didn't tell anyone from school. What was the point? They'd already written me off as the girl who'd ruined her life over a boy, and I definitely didn't tell Derek. Recovery was brutal in ways nobody had prepared me for. My body had spent 9 months preparing for motherhood, but had no baby to care for. My breasts ached with milk meant for Oliver. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. expecting to hear crying, then remember with crushing clarity that he wasn't coming home, ever. The hormonal crash was devastating. 1 minute I'd be numb, going through motions like a robot. The next I'd be sobbing uncontrollably over television commercials or strangers' babies in grocery stores. My emotions were completely unpredictable. The hospital sent me home with pamphlets about grief counseling and support groups for mothers who'd lost babies. But how do you explain to a room full of women who'd held their babies for days or weeks or months that you only got 3 hours? That your grief was somehow less valid because your loss happened so quickly? I tried one support group meeting, sat in a circle of folding chairs in a church basement while women shared stories about SIDS and childhood cancer and car accidents. When it was my turn to speak, I mumbled something about stillbirth and never went back. Their losses were different from mine. They had memories of first steps and birthday parties and bedtime stories. I had 3 hours and a handful of photographs. It felt like claiming membership in a club where I hadn't paid enough dues. Aunt Rochelle forced me back into the world after a month, made me shower, eat real food, leave the apartment. The outside world felt foreign and overwhelming. Colors seemed too bright. Sounds were too loud. Everyone else was moving forward with their lives while mine had stopped completely. I returned to work at the grocery store because I needed the money and the distraction. Mrs. Petrosky welcomed me back with gentle kindness, never asking questions about what had happened. She just scheduled me for day shifts and made sure I wasn't working alone until I felt ready. Customers who'd watched my pregnancy with interest now avoided eye contact. They knew something had gone wrong but didn't know what to say. Small-town gossip traveled fast, but tragedy made people uncomfortable. It was easier to pretend they didn't see me than to acknowledge the elephant in the room. I got my GED that summer, studying while other kids my age were working summer jobs and getting ready for college. The test was easy. I'd always been smart, even if being pregnant had made people forget that. But walking across a stage in a gymnasium to receive a diploma felt hollow when the future I'd planned was buried in Oakwood Cemetery. I enrolled in community college that fall, partly because Aunt Rochelle pushed me and partly because I needed something to do with my hands and my mind. The other students were mostly older, people going back to school after divorces or job losses, young mothers trying to build better lives for their families. Nobody asked about my story. In a classroom full of second chances, everyone understood that some questions were better left unasked. I could sit in the back row and be anonymous, just another student working toward a degree. I threw myself into studying to avoid thinking about what I'd lost. Biology, chemistry, anatomy. I devoured everything about how bodies worked, maybe hoping I could understand what had gone wrong with Oliver, why his perfect little body hadn't been able to do the one thing that mattered most. The more I learned about pregnancy and childbirth, the more I understood that sometimes things just go wrong, that even perfect prenatal care and healthy mothers can lose babies to complications nobody could have predicted or prevented. But understanding didn't make the loss hurt less. Slowly, I developed a plan. I wanted to help other mothers, other babies. I wanted to be there during the moments that mattered most, when new life entered the world, or when families said goodbye too soon. I became obsessed with helping other mothers. Volunteered at the NICU, holding premature babies whose parents couldn't visit during the day. Their tiny hands would grip my finger with surprising strength, and I'd tell them stories about a brother they'd never meet who would have loved them. I worked as a doula during my last year of college, supporting women through labor. It was emotionally challenging, being present for other people's happiest moments while carrying the weight of my own loss. But every healthy cry from a newborn felt like a small victory. Every mother I comforted through loss understood my pain without me saying a word. There was a secret society of women who'd lost babies, and we recognized each other instantly. A look, a hesitation when someone asked about children, a particular kind of sadness that never fully went away. We didn't need to share details to understand each other's pain. Eventually, I became a labor and delivery nurse. The job was emotionally exhausting but deeply meaningful. I was there for the moments that changed everything, when families grew or when they learned to say goodbye before they'd even said hello. I specialized in high-risk pregnancies and bereavement care. When things went wrong, when monitors started beeping warnings or when ultrasounds revealed problems, I was the nurse families wanted. Someone who understood that medical emergencies were human tragedies, that statistics were real people facing impossible situations. I never dated seriously. How do you explain to someone that you had a child who died? That you're technically a mother but have nothing to show for it except a grave you visit every Sunday, and a nursery you've never been able to dismantle? A few men tried. There was David from nursing school who took me to dinner 3 times before I found the courage to tell him about Oliver. He said all the right things about how sorry he was, how strong I must be, how it didn't change how he felt about me. But I could see the pity in his eyes, the way he started treating me like something fragile that might break if he held me too tightly. There was Michael from the hospital who asked me out for 2 months before I finally said yes. He was kind and patient and genuinely interested in my life. But when he started talking about wanting kids someday, about the family he hoped to have, I had to end it. How could I explain that I'd already had a family, even if it only lasted 3 hours? Then there was Thomas, a social worker who understood loss because he worked with grieving families every day. We dated for almost a year, and I thought maybe I could build something real with someone who understood tragedy. But even he couldn't handle the way I shut down every March, the way Oliver's birthday and death day turned me into someone he didn't recognize. "You're stuck," he said during our final argument. "You won't let yourself heal because you think moving forward means forgetting him." Maybe he was right, but forgetting felt like a betrayal of the only child I'd ever have. Years passed. I built a good life. Small apartment with a garden where I grew vegetables and flowers. Reliable car that got me to work and back. Job I loved even when it broke my heart. But I never forgot Oliver. His room at Aunt Rochelle's apartment stayed exactly as I'd left it, a shrine to possibilities that never materialized. She offered to box everything up, to give me space to move forward, but I couldn't bear the thought of packing away the only physical proof that he'd existed. The crib, the changing table, the mobile with dancing elephants. They represented 9 months of hope and love and preparation. I visited his grave every Sunday after church, brought flowers, usually daisies because they were cheerful and lasted longer than roses. I'd sit on the small bench Aunt Rochelle had paid to have installed and tell him about my week, about the babies I'd helped deliver, the mothers I'd comforted, the life I was building in his memory. I told him about his father, too, how I'd seen Derek's name in the local paper when he graduated from dental school, how his engagement announcement had taken up half a page, complete with professional photos and details about the bride's family lineage, how successful he'd become, how perfect his life looked from the outside. And I never forgot the boy who abandoned us both. I followed Derek's life from a distance through mutual friends and the inevitable small-town gossip network. He'd done well at state, graduated with honors, got into dental school at the university, met a girl from a good family during his residency. They had a picture-perfect relationship that played out on social media like a fairy tale. He married her 3 years after graduation in a ceremony that took up 2 full pages in the local newspaper. She was beautiful, blonde, educated, from money, everything a successful man was supposed to want. They honeymooned in Europe and bought a house in the best part of town, the kind of place I dreamed about when we were 17 and planning our future together. The house had 5 bedrooms, a 3-car garage, and a pool. The kind of place where children could grow up with every advantage, where family photos would line the mantelpiece and Christmas mornings would be magical. Everything I'd imagined for Oliver, this other woman's children would have. I heard through the grapevine that they'd struggled with fertility for a few years. Multiple miscarriages, Treatments that didn't work, the kind of heartbreak that money couldn't fix. Part of me felt guilty for the satisfaction I took in their struggle, but a larger part wondered if this was karma, if the universe was making him pay for abandoning his first child. Then came our 10-year reunion. I almost didn't go. What was the point? But Aunt Rochelle convinced me. You need closure, she said. You need to see who he became and realize you're better off without him. The hotel ballroom was decorated with our school colors, blue and gold streamers hanging from every surface. Class of 2014 banners proclaimed our achievements and reminded us how young we'd been when we thought we knew everything about love and life. A slideshow played on a large screen, cycling through photos from our high school years. There was Derek throwing touchdown passes, accepting the homecoming crown, posing with the state championship trophy. There was me in the background of some shots, at school dances, in group photos, young and innocent and completely unaware of what was coming. Everyone looked older, but was trying to hide it. The women wore dresses that cost more than my monthly rent, and shoes that would have bought groceries for a month. The men had developed beer guts they sucked in for photos and hairlines that had retreated significantly since graduation. The conversations were predictable. Career updates, marriage announcements, children's accomplishments. Everyone trying to prove they'd lived up to their teenage potential, that they'd become the adults they'd dreamed of being at 18. I spotted Derek immediately. Still tall, still handsome, still commanding attention from across the room. He wore an expensive navy suit that probably cost more than my car payment. His hair was perfectly styled with just enough gray at the temples to look distinguished. His smile was magazine-ready, the kind that had made me fall in love with him when we were kids. And there was his wife, gorgeous, blonde, wearing a flowing dress that couldn't hide her rounded belly. She had to be about 6 months along, maybe 7. Her hand rested protectively on her stomach in that unconscious way pregnant women do, and I felt a stab of jealousy so sharp it took my breath away. I watched him place his hand over hers, lean down to whisper something that made her laugh. The tenderness in his gesture was everything I dreamed about during those 9 months I carried Oliver. Everything I'd imagined when I pictured telling him the baby was kicking, or when I practiced asking him to feel how strong our son was getting. The sight made me physically sick. He was getting everything he wanted. The successful career, building a dental practice that served 3 counties, the beautiful wife who came from the right family and said the right things at dinner parties, the baby he was excited about, planned for, prepared to love and support. Meanwhile, I was still visiting a tiny grave every Sunday, wondering what Oliver would have looked like at 10 years old. Whether he would have inherited Derek's athletic ability or my love of reading. Whether he would have been tall or short, quiet or loud, artistic or competitive. I turned to leave, but Jessica Morrison, Brett's younger sister, spotted me from across the room. Before I could escape, I was surrounded by former classmates who acted like we'd been best friends, asking about my job, my life, whether I was married. The nursing profession impressed them. It was respectable, stable, the kind of career parents bragged about. They didn't need to know about the specialization in bereavement care, about why I'd chosen to work with families facing loss. Nobody mentioned the pregnancy that had ended my senior year. Either they'd forgotten or they were too polite to bring it up. Small-town manners meant we all pretended the elephant in the room didn't exist. I was making my way toward the exit when he saw me. Our eyes met across the crowded room. For a moment, that 17-year-old guilt flickered in his face. The same expression he'd worn in his car that rainy afternoon when I told him I was pregnant. Then he composed himself, whispered something to his wife, and walked over. "Hey," he said, like we were old friends catching up. "You look good, thanks." I could see him struggling with what to say next. How do you make small talk with the girl whose life you derailed? How do you pretend the past didn't happen when it's standing right in front of you? The conversation was awkward, full of false starts and careful avoidance of certain topics. He told me about his practice, about buying the old Miller building downtown and renovating it into a modern clinic, about his wife's family, their connections to the country club set, their shared interests in golf and charity work. I told him about nursing school, about working at the regional medical center, about the apartment I'd bought with my own money. Safe topics that didn't reveal too much about the journey between 17 and 27. But I could see the question in his eyes, the one he wanted to ask but didn't know how. So, he glanced around nervously, checking to see who might be listening. How's the kid? The question hit me like a physical blow. After 10 years of silence, after pretending I didn't exist, after building a perfect life while I struggled through the consequences of our shared mistake, this was what he chose to ask. He couldn't even say our son's name, couldn't even pretend he'd ever cared enough to wonder. "Which part do you want to know first?" I asked quietly. He looked confused. "What do you mean? I mean, do you want to know about the 43 hours of labor? About how they tried everything to save him? About the funeral you never knew happened? Or should I start with the grave I visit every Sunday?" His face went white. His mouth opened and closed like he was drowning. "What are you talking about?" "Oliver died during delivery," I said simply, cord around his neck. He never took a breath. The color drained from his face completely. His hands started shaking. "You're lying." I pulled out my phone, scrolled to the photo I kept hidden deep in my gallery, the only picture I had of Oliver, swaddled in a white blanket, looking like he was sleeping peacefully, his perfect little face, so still and quiet. Derek stared at the screen. His hands trembled as he tried to process what he was seeing. "When?" he whispered. "March 15th. He would have been 10 last month." I watched him do the math, watched the realization hit that he'd had a son for exactly 1 day and never knew it. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice cracked. I laughed bitterly. "Tell you what? That the problem you walked away from died anyway? That your scholarship was safe because the baby who might have ruined your future was buried in a grave the size of a shoebox?" People were starting to stare. His wife looked confused from across the room, probably wondering why her husband was having an intense conversation with a woman she didn't recognize. Other classmates glanced over, sensing drama but not understanding the context. You should have told me, he repeated. Why? So you could feel guilty for 10 years instead of living your perfect life? So you could pretend you would have stayed and helped when we both know you wouldn't have? He was crying now. Real tears, not the kind he used to fake to get out of trouble in high school. I could have, you could have what? I cut him off, paid for the funeral, held my hand while I picked out a casket, visited his grave on his birthday. His shoulders shook. I looked at this man who had once been everything to me and felt nothing but pity. You want to know the worst part? I continued. It's not that he died. It's that he died believing his father didn't want him. Because even in those 3 hours I held him, I couldn't lie and say daddy was coming. That broke him completely. He sobbed like a child, drawing stares from everyone nearby. People were starting to whisper, pointing at the successful dentist having a breakdown in the middle of his high school reunion. His wife appeared at his side looking panicked. Honey, what's wrong? Is everything okay? I looked at her swollen belly, at her concerned face, at her hand reaching protectively for her husband. She was probably a nice person. She didn't deserve to have her perfect evening ruined by ghosts from her husband's past. Everything's fine, I said. Just catching up with an old friend. But I wasn't done. Congratulations on the baby, I told her sincerely. Then I looked directly at Derek. I hope this one lives. The words hung in the air like a curse. His wife's face went pale as she tried to understand what was happening. Other classmates had stopped their own conversations to watch the drama unfold. I walked away as he collapsed into a chair, his wife frantically asking what was happening. I could hear him trying to explain through sobs, could hear her sharp intake of breath when she understood, could hear the whispers starting as words spread through the crowd. I drove straight to the cemetery, sat beside Oliver's grave in my reunion dress, the first nice dress I'd bought in years, telling him about Daddy's reaction, how he finally cried for the son he never knew existed. The parking lot is quiet at night, I said to the headstone. Just me and you and the stars. I told him about the woman who was carrying his half-sibling, about how Derek had finally asked about him after all these years. I'm sorry it took him so long to wonder about you, baby, I whispered. But at least now he knows you existed. At least now he knows you mattered. I stayed until dawn, watching the sun rise over the small section of Oakwood Cemetery reserved for children. Other tiny headstones caught the early light, names and dates that told stories of dreams interrupted, futures cut short, families forever changed. The next morning, there were 17 missed calls from Derek. Text messages begging me to call him back, voicemails of him sobbing apologies, saying he wanted to know everything about Oliver, asking if he could visit the grave. His voice was raw, broken. In one message, he said he'd told his wife everything, about the pregnancy, about abandoning me, about the son he'd never known. She'd packed a bag and gone to her mother's house, unable to process the betrayal and the grief all at once. I blocked his number. 2 days later, Aunt Rochelle called. There's someone here to see you, she said. He won't leave. I found Derek sitting on her porch steps, still in his reunion suit. He looked like he hadn't slept or eaten since that night. His eyes were red and swollen, his perfect hair disheveled. His expensive watch and wedding ring were gone, probably pawned or thrown away in a moment of self-hatred. Please, he said when he saw me. I need to know about him. I need to know about our son. I sat down beside him, this broken man who used to be the center of my universe. His name was Oliver James, I began. He weighed 6 pounds, 2 ounces. The doctor said he was perfect except for the cord. He had your nose and my chin. He was so quiet. Even when he wasn't breathing, he looked peaceful. I told him everything. About the pregnancy, about working at the grocery store while my belly grew, about the kicks that kept me awake at night and how I'd play music for him through headphones pressed against my stomach, about the nursery I'd painted, about the books I'd read to prepare for motherhood. I told him about being thrown out by my parents, about living with Aunt Rochelle, about the loneliness and fear and determination to give our baby the best life possible, about saving every penny for diapers and formula, about the secondhand crib we'd assembled together. I told him about labor, about the 43 hours of pain, about how scared I was, about how Aunt Rochelle held my hand through every contraction, about the moment when the monitors started beeping and everyone's faces changed. I told him about the doctors trying everything, vacuum extraction, forceps, emergency procedures that left me torn and bleeding, but couldn't save our son, about watching them perform CPR on a chest too small for such violent intervention. I told him about holding Oliver afterward, about the 3 hours that were the best and worst of my life, about naming him, about the photos Aunt Rochelle took with her old camera, about the way his tiny hand fit perfectly around my finger. I told him about the funeral where only 3 people came to say goodbye, about choosing a casket the size of a jewelry box, about the gravestone that cost more than I made in a month, about the reception afterward where we sat in silence and tried to understand how someone so wanted could be gone so quickly. He listened to every word, tears streaming down his face. When I described Oliver's features, the way he looked exactly like both of us, Derek doubled over with grief. When I finished, he asked, "Can I see him?" The cemetery was quiet that afternoon. Spring was just starting, daffodils pushing up through the winter brown grass, trees beginning to bud. Oliver's section was peaceful, with small headstones arranged in neat rows and a bench where parents could sit and remember. I led him to the white marble headstone with Oliver's name and dates. Derek fell to his knees beside it, touching the carved letters with shaking fingers. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the grave. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I left your mom. I'm sorry I never got to meet you." He stayed there for an hour, talking to a son he'd never held, telling him about the football games he'd wanted to teach him, about the dental practice he'd hoped to pass down someday, about the colleges he'd dreamed of Oliver attending. He talked about the life they could have had together, weekend camping trips, teaching him to drive, helping with homework, watching him graduate and maybe become a doctor or a teacher or whatever he wanted to be, promising to visit every year, to never forget him again, to be better than the coward who'd walked away. When he finally stood up, his face was different, older, sadder, but somehow more real than I'd ever seen him. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you go home to your wife and your baby," I said. "You be the father to that child that you couldn't be to Oliver. But what about us? What about what I did to you?" I looked at this man who had shaped so much of my pain and realized something had shifted. The anger I'd carried for 10 years felt lighter somehow. Not gone. It might never be completely gone, but manageable. "There is no us," I said gently. "There hasn't been since the day you drove away. But there's Oliver. And now you can carry him with you too." His marriage didn't survive the revelation. I heard through the grapevine that his wife couldn't handle the secret he'd kept, the child he'd abandoned, the guilt that consumed him afterward. She felt betrayed not just by what he'd done as a teenager, but by the fact that he'd never told her about it. The pregnancy became complicated by stress. She moved back to her parents' house, filed for divorce, fought for custody of their daughter when she was born 2 months later. The perfect life Derek had built crumbled under the weight of truth. His practice suffered too. Word spread quickly in our small town about the reunion incident, about the baby who died, about the girl he'd abandoned. Some patients stayed loyal, but others found new dentists. The country club membership was quietly rescinded. The perfect reputation he'd spent years building dissolved overnight. But Derek kept his promise to Oliver. I visit our son's grave every Sunday after church, and sometimes there are fresh flowers there that I didn't bring. Small toys, a football, toy cars, books about dinosaurs, pictures of the half-sister he'll never meet, a little girl with blonde hair and her mother's smile but Oliver's nose. Derek started coming regularly, usually on Saturdays so we wouldn't run into each other. He'd bring lunch and sit for hours, telling Oliver about his week, about the patients he'd helped, about how sorry he was for all the birthdays he'd missed. He volunteers at the Children's Hospital now, donates to organizations that support teen mothers and families dealing with infant loss. He started a scholarship fund at our old high school for pregnant students who want to finish their education, the Oliver James Memorial Scholarship. The scholarship pays for childcare, books, and tuition for young mothers trying to build better lives. 3 girls have graduated because of Oliver's fund. They send thank you cards every semester, photos of their children, updates on their progress toward degrees and careers. We don't talk much, a text on Oliver's birthday, a nod if we see each other at the cemetery, but I can see in his eyes that he carries the weight of what he lost. What we all lost. He's aged 10 years in the past few months. The guilt and grief have carved lines around his eyes, turned his hair completely gray. But there's something different about him too, a depth that wasn't there before, a recognition of consequences that goes beyond his own comfort. His ex-wife allows him supervised visits with their daughter every other weekend. The little girl looks so much like Oliver it takes my breath away. Same dark hair, same stubborn chin, same serious expression when she's concentrating. Sometimes I wonder what Oliver would have been like at 10. Would he have played football like his dad? Would he have inherited my love of books? Would he have been the kind of kid who collected bugs or built elaborate Lego cities or spent hours drawing pictures of imaginary worlds? But mostly I just remember those 3 perfect hours when he was mine. When I was somebody's mother, even if only briefly. When love was enough, even if it couldn't save him. The nurses at work sometimes ask why I never had other children. I tell them I'm focused on my career, that I like my independence. I don't tell them that part of me died with Oliver, that some losses are too big to recover from completely. But I also don't tell them about the hope I carry, that somewhere, somehow, Oliver knows his daddy finally came looking for him, that in the end, love found a way, even if it was 10 years too late. Last month, I helped deliver twins to a 17-year-old girl whose boyfriend had disappeared when she told him she was pregnant. As I placed those healthy crying babies in her arms, I thought about Oliver, about second chances and the different ways life can unfold. The girl looked up at me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Thank you. You're going to be a wonderful mother," I told her. And I meant it. Her boyfriend showed up 3 hours later, panicked and apologetic. He'd been at work when she went into labor, had driven 90 miles an hour to get to the hospital. He held his sons with shaking hands and cried when they wrapped their tiny fingers around his. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised her. "We're going to figure this out together." Some stories have different endings. The girl's name was Melissa, and she was exactly the same age I'd been when I got pregnant. But her story unfolded differently. Her boyfriend stayed, their families rallied around them, their babies lived to see their first breath and their second and their 1,000th. I've followed their progress through social media. The boys are healthy and happy, growing fast, hitting every milestone. Their father works construction during the day and takes classes at night. Their mother finished her GED and is studying to be a medical assistant. They named one of the twins Oliver. When I saw the birth certificate, I had to excuse myself from the room, sat in a supply closet and cried for 20 minutes, overwhelmed by the strange gift of having my son's name attached to a living, breathing child. They don't know about my Oliver. To them, it's just a name they liked, strong and classical and full of possibility. But every time I see little Oliver in the NICU for his follow-up appointments, I feel like some part of my son lives on. Time moves differently when you're carrying the weight of loss. Some days feel endless. The anniversaries, the holidays, the moments when other people's joy highlights your emptiness. Other days pass in a blur of work and routine and the small satisfactions of helping other families through their most vulnerable moments. I've become the nurse other staff members call when things go wrong, when monitors start beeping warnings, when ultrasounds reveal problems, when families need someone who understands that medical emergencies are personal tragedies. I've held more grieving mothers than I can count, sat with fathers who don't know how to process the loss of children they'd barely begun to imagine, helped families say goodbye to babies who never got to come home. Each loss is different, but the pain is universal. The way hope transforms into disbelief, then anger, then the kind of grief that rewrites your entire understanding of the world. I recognize it because I've lived it, but I've also been present for miracles. Babies who weren't supposed to survive but fought their way to health. Families who found strength they didn't know they possessed. Love that persisted even in the face of unimaginable loss. The job has taught me that tragedy and joy often exist in the same space. That hospitals are places where the worst and best of human experience happen simultaneously, where life begins and ends and sometimes gets a second chance. Recently, I've been thinking about retirement. Not because I'm tired of the work, but because I'm ready for something different. Maybe teaching childbirth classes, maybe working with support groups for bereaved families. Maybe just tending my garden and reading books, and visiting Oliver without the weight of other people's emergencies on my shoulders. Aunt Rochelle is getting older, needs more help with daily tasks. She's been my anchor for 13 years, the one person who never questioned my choices or pushed me to move on before I was ready. I owe her the kind of care she gave me when I had nowhere else to go. She still keeps Oliver's room exactly as it was. The crib with its cheerful mobile. The changing table stocked with supplies that were never used. The rocking chair where I spent so many hours talking to my unborn son. Sometimes I find her sitting in that chair, holding the stuffed elephant I'd bought for Oliver. She never had children of her own, but she loved him as fiercely as any grandmother. His loss was her loss too. We've talked about what to do with his things. Donate them to families in need, or pack them away, or leave them as a memorial to what might have been. Neither of us is ready to decide. Some shrines are meant to be permanent. Derek has asked if he can contribute to the scholarship fund, make it larger and more comprehensive. He wants to expand it beyond our small town, maybe create a foundation that helps young parents across the state. I haven't given him an answer yet. Part of me appreciates the gesture, the way he's trying to honor Oliver's memory, but another part worries about his motives, whether this is genuine grief or just guilt seeking absolution. Maybe it doesn't matter. If his money helps other kids finish school, if it keeps other mothers from facing the same isolation I experienced, then Oliver's legacy grows beyond the 3 hours we had together. I've started writing letters to Oliver, not the kind I used to write in my head during cemetery visits, but actual letters on paper, stories about the life he would have lived, the person he would have become, the impact he might have had on the world. In my letters, he's 10 years old and obsessed with astronomy. He builds model rockets in the garage and wants to be an astronaut when he grows up. He's kind to other kids at school, especially the ones who get picked on. He has his father's athletic ability, but uses it to include others rather than exclude them. In my letters, he asks difficult questions about life and death and why some people are born into loving families while others aren't so lucky. He wants to understand the world's unfairness, but also its capacity for unexpected grace. In my letters, he grows up to be the kind of man who stays when things get difficult, who honors his commitments and protects the people he loves, who learns from his parents' mistakes and builds something better. Maybe these letters are just wishful thinking. Maybe they're a way of keeping him alive in my imagination, but they feel like truth, like a glimpse of the person he was meant to become. Last Sunday, I found a letter tucked under the flowers at Oliver's grave. Derek's handwriting, careful and deliberate. Dear son, I'm learning about you slowly, through your mother's stories and my own imagination. I wish I could have known you when it mattered. I wish I could have been the father you deserved. Your mother says you would have been 10 years old now, old enough for Little League, for fishing trips, for the kinds of conversations fathers and sons are supposed to have. I picture you with my stubborn streak and her gentle heart, smart like both of us, but wise in ways we never were at your age. I know I have no right to claim you now, after walking away when you needed me most, but I carry you with me everywhere. Your half-sister will know about you, will understand that she has a brother watching over her. I love you. I'm sorry it took me so long to say it. Dad, I folded the letter carefully and put it in my wallet, next to the only photo I have of Oliver. Some words are too important to leave behind, because sometimes love is enough. Sometimes it has to be. Even if it comes 10 years too late, love still matters. It still has the power to change what's possible, to honor what was lost, to create meaning from meaningless tragedy. Oliver James lived for 3 hours, but his impact continues. In the scholarship that bears his name, in the families I've helped through their darkest moments, in the father who finally learned what it means to love a child he'll never get to hold. He made me a mother, even if only briefly. And that is enough. That has to be enough.